Welcome to the next online lecture for the history of modern Asia. Thus far this semester we have discussed the social structure of Japanese society. We have also discussed the rise and the fall of the shogun and the so-called restoration of the emperor to his proper place in Japanese government. Today we will look at what happens after the shogun is gone. What sort of government do the Japanese devise to replace the Tokugawa? How do the Japanese plan to resist further humiliation at the hands of the Western nations? So, let's get to it. First, let's examine this question. What constitutes a revolution? Is it a war for independence from a foreign power, like the American Revolution? Does it mean throwing off an absolutist monarchy and proclaiming rights for the people, as in the French Revolution? Does it mean a reworking of society from top to bottom, such as the Russian Revolution? Or is it this? These photographs are of the same man, the Japanese Emperor Mutsuhito. One was taken upon his ascension to the throne before the collapse of the shogun's government. The other was taken a few years later, during what became known as the Meiji period. For many in Japan, this period and this photo represented a revolution. That's because this was just one of many rapid changes to Japanese society. What were some of those changes? One of the key changes of the Meiji period was a policy called Westernization. The Japanese learned that isolation had cut them off from all of the changes in the modern world. This left them vulnerable to Matthew Perry and his black ships when they showed up in 1853. Thus, with the collapse of the Tokugawa government in 1868, a real push was made to reverse the isolation policy and explore the world. One of the first efforts was the Iwakura mission of 1871-73. More than 100 Japanese, including half of the emperor's advisors, traveled to the West to see what they could learn. The Iwakura mission visited factories, schools, and shops, and they became quickly very impressed by Western industrialization and technology. They were concerned, however. In other words, they didn't think everything they encountered in the West was so great. They were very concerned, for example, by democracy. Giving power to the people seemed to be a dangerous thing. They also were concerned by Western societies that seemed to grant equal status to women. Of course, we know today that women in the West were not equal to men. I mean, they were treated very differently than men. But for the Japanese, women seemed to have an enormous number of rights, and that was a concern that they didn't like. But the Japanese were serious about learning from the West. One thing they saw that led to an immediate change was in education. Most children in the West had an opportunity for at least some education. That was not true in Japan, where traditionally education was limited to the daimyo and samurai families. The new government quickly learned that the Japanese people could no longer afford to keep most of its population from education. An educated population seemed to be the key to the growth of Western society, and so the Japanese instituted educational reform. The first significant reform was the Education Reform Act of 1872. It required that all children, regardless of social class, be given 4 years of education. One might think that the Japanese commoner classes would have been thrilled with this development. You would be wrong. Peasants rioted and burned some of the schools to the ground. Overall, however, the reform was a success. By 1900, school attendance had reached 90% of the population. And by 1905, attendance was at 98%. That's a very, very successful, it's a very successful reform. Another area of reform involved the military. After the fall of the shogun, the Japanese adopted the slogan, "Rich country, strong army." But to achieve this goal, they knew that they needed change. Again, they used the West as their model. In these days, it was typical in Europe to require young men to serve time in the military. The Japanese decided to follow this example by creating universal conscription. Universal conscription simply meant that all men 20 years and up had to provide 3 years of military service to Japan. In other words, all men 20 years and up had to serve in the army for at least 3 years. The law was highly unpopular. Why? Well, who might object? Well, for one thing, the samurai objected. Universal conscription was a direct attack on their place and their privilege in society. Remember, they had been the only groups that had been allowed military training. They were the only groups allowed to carry weapons. And now you were going to allow commoners to carry weapons. This seemed to be a real insult to the samurai. The commoner classes also were less than thrilled at having to serve in the military. Draft centers were burned, there were riots, and really, nevertheless, I should say, this reform served as a major challenge to the traditional Japanese class system. But it also will be very successful. Japan will soon build the most powerful army in all of East Asia. So, like education reform, universal conscription is not a popular reform, but ultimately it does result in reshaping Japanese society. Another problem involved the daimyo. Remember, the daimyo were powerful landholders, and they maintained private armies of samurai. These private armies could always serve as a threat to the unity of Japan, as well as to the power of the Japanese government. To get around this problem, the new Japanese government encouraged the daimyo to donate their lands back to the emperor. Again, this is part of the Meiji restoration of the emperor's authority. In other words, you don't give it to Japan, give your lands to the emperor. This was a way of trying to really kind of encourage the daimyo to do what the Japanese government wanted them to do. Well, why would the daimyo agree to this? Well, the reality is they were bribed to do this. The new government agreed to pay the daimyo a yearly salary that was roughly 10% of what they had previously collected from the land in tax revenue. Another problem related to class dealt with the samurai. The samurai had guarded their status well for hundreds of years. The end of the Tokugawa was the beginning of the end for the samurai, however. Privileges enjoyed by the samurai, such as the right to wear swords in public, were taken away. So were the stipends paid to samurai by their daimyo. No daimyo meant samurai would no longer be paid simply to be samurai, nor would they hold such a privileged place in Japanese culture. But other symbols of samurai privilege were also removed. Specifically, samurai were no longer allowed to wear topknots in their hair. These and other changes led to a rejection of reform by the samurai classes. The most severe of this rejection came in 1877 when a group of samurai, led by Seigo Takamori, rebelled against the new government. The samurai rebellion was finally crushed by Japan's new modern army. Custom was not the only thing to change, however. With the fall of the Tokugawa, a new government was needed. That government was dominated by the daimyo, especially those from Choshu and Satsuma, with the Emperor Mutsuhito at their center. This government signaled a significant change from that of the shoguns. This became apparent almost immediately. One of the best examples of this was the Charter Oath, which was approved in 1868, the same year that the shogun was overthrown. Now, I'm going to read the Charter Oath to you. Now, you don't have to memorize this. However, it is possible that on an exam, you will be presented with the Charter Oath and asked to examine it, or asked to see why it's such a radical change from Japanese society. So anyway, let's just read through it very quickly. Deliberative assemblies shall be widely established, and all matters decided by public discussion. Think about what kind of a change that constitutes. All classes, high and low, shall unite in vigorously carrying out the administration of the affairs of state. Again, another big change. The common people, no less than civil and military officials, shall each be allowed to pursue their own calling, so that there may be no discontent. Again, think about how that represents a change. Evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based upon the just laws of nature. Finally, knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. Excuse me. Now, I want you to understand the Charter Oath does not constitute a constitution. It is not a new plan of government. It is instead more like a roadmap for where Japan wants to go, how they plan to reshape their society. But remember, I shouldn't say remember, but look at this. The Charter Oath is really quite vague. There is no discussion or specific about how deliberative assemblies shall be created. nothing about what the evil customs of the past are. In reality, the new Japanese leaders had no idea what form a permanent new government might take in Japan. In 1868, they were playing it by ear for the most part. They really didn't know exactly where they were going. In fact, Japan will continue to go without a formal government for about 21 years between the fall of the shogun and the rise of the new government. The Charter Oath is going to, as I said, sort of act as a roadmap. It's a vague roadmap, but it's a roadmap nonetheless. Ultimately, the push for westernization will lead Japan's leadership to create a new government, as I said. After studying the Western world, they discovered that Western nations had constitutions that outlined the powers of their leaders. They followed that model, and in 1889 created the Meiji Constitution. The Meiji Constitution was a radical departure from the way Japan had traditionally done things. Now, in other ways, it was really just more of the same. For one thing, this is one of the radical changes. The Constitution will create a legislative body. It's known as the Diet. And this Diet will include two houses. One is the House of Peers, which consists of wealthy and powerful individuals. And then there's a House of Representatives that is elected by at least a portion of the population. So again, just having a legislative assembly is a radical change. The powers of the Diet included the power to write and pass laws and the power to approve or veto the budget. Again, it has some significant influence. But don't make the mistake of thinking this is a democracy. Representation was strictly limited in the Constitution. Only men who owned a certain amount of property were allowed to vote, and this constituted about 1.26% of the population. That's not democracy. The new constitution also made room for the emperor, who was granted new political powers. Those powers included the power to declare war and peace and to make treaties, to appoint all government officials and advisors. He could dissolve the lower house of the legislature if he wanted. He could command the army and the navy. And he could rule when the Diet was not in session. However, his power was not absolute. His proclamations had to be co-signed by his council of advisors. Now, I want you to know, once again, I want you to be able to look at this and see, on the one hand, how this is a real change from what the emperor's role in Japanese society had traditionally been. Traditionally, the emperor had been simply a moral and spiritual leader. Now he has been being given specific political powers within the Japanese government. Nevertheless, those powers are not absolute. As it says at the bottom, he had a group of advisors who had to co-sign all of his proclamations. Who are these guys? Well, the advisors are a group of leading families and former daimyo, who now are known as the Genro. At the center were, of course, representatives from Shoshu and Satsuma. No surprise. And again, this is where the real power in Japan lay. The real power lay with the Genro. In conclusion, the main reform put forward by the Japanese after the fall of the Tokugawa was westernization. The Japanese government decided that if they were going to catch up to the West, they needed to copy the West. But what form did westernization take? Well, again, as we have discussed, it covered many things. There was educational reform. There was reform of the military. There was a reform to social class, especially with the daimyo and the samurai. And finally, a new government was put in place. With these changes, Japan will quickly emerge from the 200-year isolation of the Sakoku policy and rise to become one of the greatest powers in Asia. In fact, Japan will soon rise to challenge the West as well. Thank you for listening.